So on our way to the third big rate of the three, we have the profit rate and exploitation. In order to get to the next one, I want to kind of actually address that question that I asked and put on deferment, which is what kind of technological change do you actually get under capitalism? We've seen that that via the coercive laws of competition, you have to get some kind of technological dynamism. And we know a little bit about what that dynamism is going to be like, because the capitalists are obviously pursuing cheaper stuff, right? They want to bring down their operating costs. But we have a choice. It's not just to say they innovate is not descriptive enough, because, you know, suppose I have two inputs to my production, right? Suppose that in order to produce whatever good I produce, I need two things. I need oil, let's say, and also labor. I have a choice between the two. Which one do I try to reduce the cost of? Do I try to make my production process use less oil, or do I try to make my production process use less labor? On surface, from the perspective of the capitalist, it might kind of seem arbitrary. But when you think about the actual dynamics of the thing, it's not. So which kind of input is the capitalist going to try to bring down? And Marx argues that the nature of innovation under capitalism has an implicit labor-saving bias. There is going to be an affinity towards picking labor as the main thing that you want to reduce the cost of. If you have a choice generally between oil and labor in terms of what kind of what you want to bring down, you're generally going to pick labor regardless of your industry. That's a claim that Marx makes, or at the very least, that's a claim that ends up kind of needing to be true in order for his argument to work. I'm having, honestly, a little bit of trouble remembering which one of those it is. But let's talk about why I think it is true. Well, first of all, you might be scratching your head a bit and saying to yourself, well, haven't we already discussed why this is true? The capitalist wants to bring down V, right? Well, bringing down V isn't exactly equivalent to having an implicit labor-saving bias. Remember, bringing down V just means bringing down the requirements of what the working class needs to do for itself each day. You can bring down, if you bring down oil costs, you can't, that does end up bringing down V. You can bring down V while targeting everything other than labor. So that's not exactly the same drive as the one I'm talking about here. So if that drive that we discussed in the last video of trying to bring down V isn't exactly enough of a justification for it, then what would make a good justification for it? Well, I can think of two good answers. And answer number one I find pretty convincing personally. You know, labor power is a very special commodity. We've seen how it's special in a variety of ways already. It's the sole source of profit, for one thing. It's got a very interesting and highly variable value, right, as a commodity. Its value is the means of subsistence. It's not fixed in the same way that methods of production are fixed. But a third way that it's very special is that it's the only commodity that can rebel. It's the only commodity that has agency. The raw materials can't go on strike, can they? And so if you're the capitalist, and we'll talk about the capitalists in a second. In fact, why don't we just jump to that? So we've just finished talking about how the capitalist is going to look at the worker and they're going to see the other. They're going to see something potentially disruptive. They're going to see something potentially that throws a wrench into their machine. They're going to see something that is dangerous, and they're going to want to cut down on it. But wait, you might say, labor is the sole source of their profit, and so that might act as a deterrent, right? The capitalist might, if the capitalist understands that the laborer is where their profit's coming from, they might hesitate to try to cut back on labor, which would make sense from our perspective, but we already know that that's not the case. The capitalist goes to great lengths via their neuroses to convince themselves that labor is not the source of their profit. They're going to go to the capitalist is going to build up a whole complex to convince themselves that labor is nothing more than just an arbitrary raw material. And you will see later that when we get to the transformation problem, that at least in principle, there is a distortion effect when you go from value to price. When the capitalist looks at their bottom line, which is money and not labor time, we're going to see later that what they see is something that obfuscates where the profit comes from. They're going to look at their profit and they're not actually going to be able to even see that labor is the source of the profit. Even if they do their own individual accounting like we have done, it's only going to work out on a global scale. They're going to look at their bottom line, and from their perspective and also from what they're incentivized to convince themselves of, labor is going to look like nothing more to them than another raw material, and a dangerous one at that. And so when you combine those two things together, the fact that one, they have no clue that the labor is the source of their profits, and on the other hand, raw materials can't go on strike, you see why not only are they going to try to focus on labor saving as like the primary cost of production to reduce, you can maybe even understand something that we're going to see more clearly later, which is that this bias is kind of extreme. They might even be willing to spend more on raw materials than before. They might even be willing to take a little bit of a hit to their own profit margin just to spend less on labor power. That's interesting too. And another reason that this bias might end up in the extreme is that the capitalist actually doesn't even really have to implement their own technology in order to have the desired effect, because the desired effect is to make your workers a more predictable and more servile quantity within your whole equation. You want the workers to behave. You don't necessarily want the workers to disappear. You want them to shut up and behave like the raw materials. You want them to act like nothing more than objects. And so you need them to be disciplined. And so in terms of cutting back on labor, you might invest in labor-saving technology simply to make them feel like they're replaceable. And we see this very clearly today, right? We've been talking about self-driving cars for like a freaking decade. We've been thinking about, you've seen that these self-checkout lines have existed for like a decade, and yet you still have truckers more or less being the most important worker in this country. You still have, people at the grocery store at the checkout lines. But this technology has nonetheless been successful because it has rendered those groups of workers with a feeling in their heads that they're replaceable, and so they're going to stay quiet, which is exactly what the capitalist wants. That's one of the main reasons why they've invested in this technology to begin with. This is I mentioned in the last video that portion of the day C is kind of politically neutral, but I was sort of lying. We're sort of at a point where we're starting to see that even that region C in the beginning of the day is actually not politically neutral at all, because technological progress and how machine focused and as opposed to labor focused your society is, that itself is becoming a theater of class struggle. So that's just something to keep in mind as we keep going. So another answer I can give you to this question of why there's a labor-saving bias is it has to do with accumulation, which is something that we're going to really focus on in the next video. That to scale up an economy means to bring more workers into the workforce. That's the only way to do it. We're going to see, we'll talk more about this later, but I think you can understand immediately now that accumulation in the economy, that is the scaling up of the economy, is one-to-one with an increase in the size of your workforce. And that means that your workforce, and so if you're not doing imperialism, which big if, right? But if you're not, then the ability for you to accumulate is going to be limited by the speed at which your workers are not just reproducing, but producing a bigger population. We're in a current era where populations in most of these developed countries aren't even growing at all. So I mean, there's a contradiction there between the necessity of accumulation and the necessity of a growing population for your workforce. It's going to be the case, like literally going to be the case, that the rate of accumulation outpaces the rate of population growth, because just the very kind of nature of this thing. I'm taking my surplus out and I'm putting it in to production. And if I keep doing that, if I'm taking a percentage out of my surplus every day, then that does give me kind of exponential growth, at least in principle. The desire of capitalism, the desire of accumulation is exponential accumulation, and that is completely out of step generally with how fast the population actually grows. And so to resolve that contradiction, of course, is to make your society more regime focused, to just bring down the labor required to make all the stuff. I can accumulate more stuff if I just bring down the labor required to make more stuff. And that's kind of a way to sort of, at least in principle, sidestep this issue. So that's another reason for this. Okay, so now we're finally ready to talk about the last of the kind of three major ratios that are kind of central to a Marxist kind of thinking. This one is, it looks just like the others, but I should warn you, it's a little bit more weird than the others. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that is a little different than how Marx talked about it. Marx had like 3 different versions of it. I'm going to, instead of mentioning 3 different versions of it, just talk about why later on he did that, and address it in a different way. But anyway, it's this thing. It's the composition of capital. I'm going to call it K, and it's equal to C over V. So it's essentially the ratio of like raw materials costs for society to labor costs for society. In some sense, you can say that it measures productivity, either for society or for an individual capitalist firm. But the reason I say in some sense, it's not really the measure of labor productivity. When I talk about productivity, I'm saying something like I can make 20 shoes per worker hour. If I hire a worker to work 1 hour, they can make 20 shoes, right? That's productivity, but that's not exactly what's here in value terms. Because remember, the capitalist does not actually pay for the entire hour if they get a worker hour, right? If it's 20 shoes per hour, then what the capitalist is going to go out and pay for labor in order to make 20 shoes is less than 1 hour worth of labor, because they get surplus for if the exploitation is 1, that is to say that V equals S, then for every hour of work that the capitalist buys, they get an hour for free. And so they're not going to pay for an hour of work, they're going to pay for 30 minutes of work. And so C over V is not exactly the same as labor productivity. It's actually inflated. It's bigger than that's going to be, because V is going to be smaller. So, a better measure of labor productivity in value terms would be C over L, where L is V plus S, right? The entire just sum of all the labor. This is different than that. What we're talking about when we talk about C over V is we're talking about essentially how the capitalist is going to choose to split up their necessary costs between raw materials and labor. So if the capital, as we mentioned, the capitalist goes to the market every day, and they go with a certain amount of money that they need to spend. And of course, they're going to spend some of it on raw materials, and they're going to spend some of it on labor. And C over V represents that composition, how they're going to split it up. So in my example here, if K equals 2, and they've got 300 of hours or dollars, however you want to think about it, to invest, then they're going to split it between 200 invested in raw materials and 100 in labor power. And the reason that translates from K equaling 2 is that it's what K equals 2 means is that the capitalist is on average spending twice as much on raw materials as they are on labor power. So that's what C over V represents, kind of as an accounting measure for the capitalist. It's kind of a there's nothing about exploitation here. It's strictly a ratio of necessary costs, but it does correspond heavily to the technological state of society, and so we're going to see that for ourselves. And so what we're about to do is we're about to kind of go through the derivation of what Marx would call the law of the increasing composition of capital, which is basically we're going to put together everything we've said and come to the conclusion that this guy has a tendency to increase over time, and not just increase over time, but accelerate over time in a very powerful way. And that, in my opinion, it's impossible to separate that argument as Marx gave it from his argument for the law of the decreasing profit rate, right? The law of the falling profit rate. In my opinion, as far as Marx's argument goes, those two claims are equivalent to one another. And I should preface this by saying that what I'm presenting is Marx's argument. I'm not so much interested in presenting other people's opinions on it or criticism of it. I'm just going to present it as he would have wanted to present it to you, and add a little to it as I go. So what we're going to start with is this process we talked about of innovation. So we mentioned that this composition of capital is basically a measure of technology, and we've talked a bit at this point about what kind of technological development you get. And so at this point, we've kind of come to the conclusion that the capitalists, in their pursuit to cut costs, are going to put some money into research and development, and they're going to tend to focus on reducing the labor times required to make stuff specifically. Now, we're going to go through basically a story in which a specific capitalist does this. So we've been thinking about these numbers C and V and S as societal aggregates, but we're going to kind of look at a more micro level for a while. We're going to look at a specific industry which has its own C and V, and we're going to look at a particular capitalist in that industry which has their own C and V. And for now, prior to innovation, their C over V is going to be assumed to be the same as the industry's C over V. We'll assume that the industry itself, everybody kind of uses the exact same method of production, so everybody has the same kind of C over V for that industry. But we're looking at like a particular fixed industry, maybe like the shoe industry or something. So our story goes like this. We have a capitalist, and they've invested a lot of their surplus into research and development, and they have found a new method of production in which production of shoes requires half as much labor as before. So maybe before it took an hour to make 20 pairs of shoes. Now it only takes 30 minutes to make 20 pairs of shoes. They've discovered a way to do that. Also, I should mention this, and I've been kind of assuming this, but I'll say it formally now, which is that we're assuming the naive labor theory of value, which means that there's just some number that you multiply to go back and forth between dollars and hours. But I'm going to assume that number is 1. In other words, $1 equals 1 hour, just for simplicity's sake. So that way, you don't really have to worry about what the numbers are. What are the numbers? They're dollars, and they're also hours, or whatever you feel like thinking of them as. So kind of try to think fluidly about these numbers. They're dollars, and they're also hours. So let's think about this capitalist. They are obviously going to immediately implement this new technology of theirs that reduces the labor time. And let's think about what happens to the value of the commodity. Now, what we have to remember is what value is. Value is not the labor time for an individual capitalist producing something. Value is the socially necessary labor time. You can think of it as an average, or more accurately, you can think of it as the amount of time that society deems necessary to produce the thing. And so if you have one capitalist out of a whole bunch that have come up with this new method of production, and only one of them is changing how they're producing things, then that doesn't change how much time society is deeming necessary to make the thing. It's still the same. The value of the commodity remains the same, even if this new capitalist, this one capitalist, is producing the commodity at what seems like a lower value. They've cut their own costs, but the value has not changed. So, for example, suppose that a commodity before innovation takes 10 hours of raw materials to make and 10 hours of labor. Then the capitalist has that and is now spending 10 hours on raw materials and only needs 5 hours of labor to make it. Well, then eventually, once this becomes generalized, once this new technique becomes picked up by all capitalists, then the value will have become 15. But for now, it's still 20. But the capitalist is going to be making it as if it were 15. And so because of that, they're going to be taking in more profit than before. They're going to be selling at a price which for them is greater than what it should be. And so they're going to be making super profits. But these super profits are only temporary because of the coercive laws of competition. Once the other capitalists are going to be forced to adopt the same method of production, and once they all adopt the same method of production, once this new technique has become generalized, then the value will have become 15, and the super profits will stop happening. The capitalists will no longer be getting those super profits. They'll be probably making something similar to what they made before. And so it's a temporary boost in profits is what you really get from innovation, is just a temporary boost in profits and an aggressive position towards your competitors. Maybe you can eventually devour them or something. So just as an exercise, let's kind of make sure that we understand why the other capitalists are forced to adopt this new technique of production. Suppose I'm another capitalist, I'm looking at this guy, and I'm looking at his new technique, and I just don't like it. It just bothers me. Something about it just bothers me. I don't feel like doing it. I just want to sit on the couch. I just want to relax. Why do I have to do this? I don't want to do this. Well, the reason I have to do this is because if I don't do it, and somebody else does, or if everybody else does, I suppose, then I'll be the only one using an outdated mode of production, and so the value will have changed, but I will be producing at a higher value than what the thing is worth. And so I will be taking in the opposite of super profits. When I go and sell the thing, I will be, if I'm the only one using an outdated method of production, then I'm going to be getting less than what I should be in terms of how much profit I should be taking in. It's a complete inversion of the situation of getting super profits, and this inversion is very dangerous. It's very likely that it is no longer even profitable to do the method of production that I'm doing. It's very likely that I can't even cover my own cost of production anymore, or if I can cover my cost of production, get enough surplus to live the way I've been living. And this is especially true if profit margins are razor thin to begin with, which, since the profit rate is going to be lowering, as we'll see, is very likely to be the case. Because of that, because if I don't do it and somebody else does, then I lose, then I have to do it. And this really is the coercive laws of competition in a nutshell, right? It's that if I don't do it and somebody else does, then I'm in trouble, and therefore I have to do it. And so everybody else, for fear of everybody else, has to implement this new technique of production. And then once they do that, the value will have fallen. But the fall of the value will not be the only thing to have changed. The industry itself will have changed at that point. And so let's look at how the industry is different now. So let's go back to the shoe kind of example. I was making 20 shoes per hour. That was the labor productivity. But now I've halved the labor time required to do it. And so now I only require 30 minutes to do that. And so essentially I'm manufacturing 40 shoes per hour. Now let's think of this on an hourly basis. I need to keep a worker working for an hour. If I hire a worker to work for me for an hour, then I need to keep them working for an hour. But now that worker can process a greater mass of raw materials than they previously had to. Before, I only had to buy them enough raw materials to make 20 pairs of shoes. But now, in 1 hour, I have to buy them enough materials for them to make 40 pairs of shoes. And so what's going to happen is when you look at the composition of how I'm spending my money, what this is going to lead to is it's going to lead to a situation in which I am now spending a greater percentage of my necessary costs as raw materials. I'm going to be spending more on raw materials. I'm going to be spending less on labor, but I'm going to be spending more on raw materials too. And we'll show this more mathematically in a few minutes, but we're going to see that the amount more that I'm going to be spending on raw materials is exactly the opposite of what I have managed to save in the required labor. And so that's what I mean right here when I write that delta C is equal to negative delta L. The change in how much I need in terms of raw materials for processing is exactly the negative of how much labor I have managed to save with my new technology. But here's the thing, and I want to preface this by saying we're about to kind of show this more visually so that I think it makes more sense when we do it that way. We're about to draw some pictures to illustrate this. But the thing is that this is the amount of labor that I have saved total. I researched labor saving technology, but the amount of labor that I save is not the same as the amount of wages I pay because I get surplus value. And so if my research leads me to a certain amount of labor saved, then that will lead me to a certain amount of wages saved, but the amount of change in how much I've saved on wages, that's going to be less than the amount that I've saved on labor because I get some of that labor for free via exploitation. That's really going to be a crucial fact that leads us to all of our results. So in other words, I'm going to be spending more on raw materials. I'm going to have to shovel more and more raw materials into this labor machine to keep it operating for an hour. And on the bright side, at the same time, I will be spending less on wages, but the amount that I'm going to be spending on less on wages is actually going to be outdone by the amount extra that I have to spend on raw materials, assuming that the cost of those raw materials stay the same. So I think that needs to be kind of shown kind of visually. So let's draw some pictures to make sense of what I just said. So just to kind of remind ourselves of the assumptions, we are assuming that the cost of raw materials stay the same. I'm not sure if I said that. So I invented this new method of production that requires less labor, but I haven't changed the raw materials that I'm using, and the amounts of raw material stays the same, which, you know, isn't exactly realistic, but I'm just doing that for simplicities. We'll kind of just to make the point that I want to make. Same thing with the rate of exploitation. If I'm reducing, you know, the cost of something, that it's very likely that this V will have changed just a tiny bit, but nonetheless, I'm just one industry out of many, so this rate of exploitation kind of stays the same. And in fact, let's just assume that E is a specific number. Let's assume that E is 1. So E being 1 means that S equals V, meaning that for every hour of labor that I purchase, I get an hour of labor for free. And so I've split my region up. So this is kind of the prior to my invention. This is what the shoe industry looks like. Given an hour of product from the shoe industry, if you take a random shoe and you say to yourself, how much of this shoe was raw materials before, and how much of it was living labor added on to those raw materials, then this much of it was raw materials, and this much of it was actually living labor added to the raw materials. And the way that the rate of exploitation factors in is that it tells me essentially however long this region L is here, the rate of exploitation tells me where I should place the line. So because it's 1, I should basically put the line right in the middle. So basically, like, this is L, and so if the rate of exploitation is 1, then basically I need exactly, how much do I need to pay? I need to pay exactly half what I should pay, because I get half for free. And so I put this line right in the middle. So I just split L in half. That's what E tells me to do. The rate of exploitation tells me where to place this second line within this box here. And again, the reason for that, it's a little confusing, is that if I have an hour of product from the shoe industry, and I take a random shoe and I ask myself, like, how much of this shoe that I'm staring at was raw materials in terms of its value, and how much of it was like labor added onto those raw materials. I have this box, and so if I'm taking from that and thinking about the capitalist and what they spent, they didn't actually buy half of the labor that went into that shoe that I'm holding. They only bought half of it. That's what the rate of exploitation being 1 tells me, and so because of that, I put a line in the middle. That's what it means. So this is really V, and this is S. But the whole thing is L. Now let's do the after. Now I'm not doing this with numbers, but I just kind of want to show you the idea, which is that what have we said? We've said that per hour I'm spending more on raw materials. So the C region is going to increase. Let's say it increases to like here. So this is C prime now. This is the new C. And this is L prime. But again, this exploitation has stayed the same. And so before it went like this. I'll put it in like green. So that's where the exploit. So basically that's how much I was saving on labor before. But now the L region is smaller, but I'm still splitting it in half. And so this is now V prime, and this is now S prime. And so if you look at it, what's happened? Well, the V region has shrunk. I'll just let me recolor it. And so you can see very clearly that the V region has shrunk. So I've kind of cleaned it up just to kind of label things. The C increased, and the L kind of decreased proportionally. But I still had to put this bar between the V and the S in the middle. And so because of that, the amount by which V has shrunk is less than the amount by which C increased. So just to make sure that you're absolutely convinced that when C increases, V has to decrease, but less than C prime, because it's very important to have that, I promise. It's very important that you have not just that K is increasing, but that C is increasing faster than V is decreasing. We really need that. I think that just a little bit of math is going to help here. So I'm going to use this notation like delta. I'm using basically, first of all, before I say delta, obviously I say I have C, and then I have C prime to represent like the new C. And I'm going to talk about like I want to talk about like how much C has changed by. So I'm going to use this Greek letter delta C, and what this stands for is the change in C. How much C has changed. And so what I mean by that is I take the new C and I subtract the old C. It's the distance between them. That's the distance between them, right? C prime minus C. Likewise, delta L is the change in L, which is L prime minus L. And I also have the following. I've been basically saying that like this is basically 1 hour of product, right? And so if this is 1 hour of product, these are also amounts of time. So I'm basically saying that C plus V plus S is equal to 1. Or if I want to rewrite L instead of V plus S, I'm really saying that C plus L is equal to 1. And if C plus L is equal to 1, then of course L is equal to 1 minus C. And it's also the case that C prime plus L prime is equal to 1. So that L prime is equal to 1 minus C prime. And so now I can write the change in L in terms of the change in C. I can say that the change in L is equal to L prime minus L. But then if I were just replace those with these two things that I wrote down, I get that this is 1 minus C prime minus 1 minus C, which is, if you kind of stare at this, I have a 1 here, and I'm going to be subtracting a 1, so those cancel out. And then I have a negative C prime, and I have a minus C. So I have negative C prime plus C. And if I factor out the negative 1 from both of these terms, I get that this is minus C prime minus C. But C prime minus C is delta C. So delta L is equal to negative delta C. In other words, the change in L is exactly the opposite of the change in C, which I'm sure most people could have guessed, but it's nice to write this down, and you'll see why in a second. So, if C increases, then L has to decrease because of this minus sign, and it's going to decrease by the exact same amount that C increased. That's what this says. But now it's a lot, I think, easier to see that the amount by which V is going to decrease is going to be less than the amount that C increased. And the reason for that is that I'm taking this amount that's exactly the same, and I'm going to split it, right? I'm putting a line right down the middle. I'm taking this change, and I'm splitting it. So now I'm taking that total change, and I'm splitting it. Between S and V. Only some of that change happens in the V region, and some of it happens in the S region. And how much of it happens in the V region versus how much in the S region depends on depends on E, depends on the rate of exploitation. The bigger the rate of exploitation, the more dramatic the difference is between how much V changes and how much C changes. So what I have here now, delta V has to be less than delta L, and delta L is equal to negative delta C. So delta V is less than the opposite of the change in C. If C increases, then V has to decrease, but it will decrease by less than how much C increased. Hopefully you're convinced of that. And it's barely any extra work to show the exact relationship between delta V and delta C. And so I think I'm going to derive that right now. If you don't care, then just jump ahead a couple seconds. But I think it's kind of striking that what the actual relationship is. So if you don't want to see that, just jump ahead. But anyway, what we have is that E is equal to S over V. And so because of that, S is equal to E times V. So L is equal to V plus S, but I can rewrite S as E times V. And so this is V plus E times V. And so if I factor out V on the left on both sides, if I factor out V on the right, then I get that this is equal to 1 plus E times V. And so I have that L is equal to 1 plus E times V, or to kind of put it the other way, I have that V is equal to 1 over 1 plus E times L. And of course, it's also the case that V prime is equal to 1 over 1 plus E times L prime. And so now I can kind of just write down exactly what the change in V is. So the change in V is equal to it's this minus this, right? It's 1 over 1 plus E times L prime minus 1 over 1 plus E times L. And so if I just kind of write that and I factor out 1 over 1 plus E from the left, then I get that this is 1 over 1 plus E times the change in L. And then if I multiply both sides by 1 plus E, then I get that finally that 1 plus E times the change in V is equal to the change in L. But the change in L is equal to negative the change in C. And so I have a very striking equation. If I just multiply the left side, the negative over, I get that the change in C is equal to negative 1 plus E times the change in V. So that's the exact relationship between how much C changes and how much V changes. If C increases, then V is going to decrease. That's what this means. But because E is positive, this thing on the right side is a bigger number. So the change in C has to be bigger than the change in V. And the more exploitation there is, the bigger that difference. That's what this says. That's what this equation says. So we've derived finally the law of the increasing composition of capital. When a capitalist implements labor-saving innovation and that new technique becomes standard in the economy, we have then that both the productivity of labor and the composition of capital K have a tendency to increase. But they don't just increase. It's not enough to just say that the composition of capital increases over time. It increases in a particular way. First of all, we've implemented labor-saving technologies. So in a sense, V is sort of the thing that I'm actually changing. V is the independent variable in this equation. K is very much a function of V, with C just kind of standing in for something. And if you're thinking of it that way, I change V, I can't change V without changing C, and they change similarly to each other. So you can think of K as increasing at like a rate of V squared. It's kind of like a parabola in V. And it's a parabola that's kind of multiplied by a coefficient that depends on E, the rate of exploitation. If you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. What I'm really trying to point out is that K doesn't just increase, it accelerates. It has to accelerate because you don't just get linear change. A linear change in V corresponds to a linear change in C, and that corresponds to a parabolic change in K. And so this has to accelerate, which is really interesting in its own right, because it basically means that the more every productivity gain stacks on the last one. The more productive you are, the bigger of a difference in productivity you see when you find any new technology at all. All new labor-saving technology is going to induce a more dramatic effect than all previous labor-saving technology. And moreover, even more than that, as long as exploitation exists, C is always going to increase more than V decreases. So we should remind ourselves at this point that we have been talking about like a single industry. We haven't been talking about the capitalist society as a whole yet. We've been talking about like we've been basically at the micro level, at the level of like the individual like type of commodity being produced. We're looking at like the shoe industry or like, you know, the towel industry or something. But you know, if this is a general thing that's happening in all the industries, then we can kind of go. Then, given all of the assumptions we've made so far, we can pretty clearly go from this micro observation to observe the same effect on the macro level. In other words, the societal C over V is going to mimic this tendency that we've observed in the shoe industry, assuming that the same kind of thing is happening in all industries. And so that is where we obtain the true, like what Marx would call the law of the increasing composition of capital, which is that this ratio C over V, it increases, it accelerates, and it accelerates in such a way that C always increases faster than V decreases. Production in general thus becomes more capital intensive over time and less labor intensive. That's what people typically tell you is what the law says. I think that you need to admit that it says something a little bit more specific than that, but this is what we needed to say, and this is what it says. And so with all of that said, we're finally ready to talk directly about the law of the falling profit rate. So I'm sure some of you have already seen it, but let's spell it out. Here's pi. We got our rate of profit right here, S over C plus V. I've also got one of my bars drawn out just to mess with. And what we have is that the composition of capital, C over V, is going to increase over time in a particular way. We have in particular that C is going to increase, that's guaranteed. V is going to decrease. Now, one of those things had to happen, but we really have that both of them happen. And C is going to do its thing faster than V does its thing. And what's the consequence of that in terms of pi? Well, V is going to shrink. Okay, well, that looks like it increases pi. But C is going to increase. Oh, okay, that looks like it's going to decrease pi. So which one is doing their... So these things are kind of in contradiction. V is decreasing, C is increasing. So if they just kind of happened at the same rate, and this is why I really wanted to make a big deal out of the fact that the claim has to be that what one is happening faster than the other. If V's decrease makes up for C's increase, then this line moves around, but this line does not. The necessary part of the day stays the same, and I'm just kind of moving this line along, and I don't actually get a change in the rate of profit. If V decreases the exact same amount as C increases, then I'm just like taking this line and like moving it over here, right? That's great and all, but the necessary part of the day is still the same length. That's why it needs to be the case that C is increasing faster than V can account for. As long as that's happening, then what's going on? Then the necessary part of the day is getting longer. So the consequence is that C plus V is increasing, i.e. the necessary part of the day and so unless the day's length is increased, unless the working day is made longer, pi is going to decrease. And let's see that very clearly by doing this. I can call this T, right? We're looking at this as like a societal aggregate now again. So this is like the whole length of the working day, that's T. And I can basically say that pi is equal to like T, I can instead of writing S, I can write T minus C plus V, right? That is S over C plus V, right? S is just the whole length minus these two chunks, right? And so if I do that, then I can write that this is equal to T over C plus V minus C plus V over C plus V, which is 1. And so pi is equal to T over C plus V minus 1. And so what we have is that if C plus V is increasing, if the necessary part of the working day is getting longer and the length of the working day is not extended, then the rate of profit will shrink. The rate of profit will fall. Stonks down, in other words. Now there's a couple of ways to, and so like to say that, to show it visually, I think is kind of the most important thing. So let's show this visually. Let's say we started with this. What the rate of profit falling, what the law of the falling profit rate looks like visually is it kind of looks like this. I'm going from like a bar like this to like a bar like this. So V is going to shrink a little bit, but not enough to make it so that the surplus day isn't getting longer. To a bar maybe like this. Oops. That's what's happening. When you think of the law of the falling profit rate, this is probably the picture that I think you should think about. If you're doing the accounting, then the general path of technology is that this S region is going to get squashed over time. The C plus V region is going to expand at the cost of this S region. And so the capitalists are going to be getting less and less out of the working day, even as the V region gets squashed. And keep in mind that the V region getting squashed means the rate of exploitation is getting bigger, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's interesting, right? Because you look at this and you're like, why would the capitalists do this? They don't want to do this. They clearly don't, right? Their goal is to make S as long as possible. They're losing their surplus part of the day over time. But the competition between them forces them into it. The competition between them forces them to do it. Now, there's counteracting factors. There's tons of them. But before I get to those, I want to kind of express this in yet another way. And the way that I'm about to show it is... if you're really trying to like convince your friends that capitalism is evil, or just show them a pretty like banger argument, I'm gonna call this the banger version of the argument. It's a little misleading, to be honest, but it's so like it's such a spicy thing to write that you have to see it. If you're really just trying to convince your friends that like capitalism is evil, then this is what you do. So have that pi is equal to S over C plus V. We have that K is equal to C over V, and we have that the rate of exploitation E is S over V. What you can do with these three things combined is you can express the rate of profit in terms of the rate of exploitation and the rate of and the composition of capital. And so what you can do is you can multiply top and bottom here by 1 over V. So multiply top and bottom of pi by 1 over V. If you do that, then I'm multiplying by 1 over V over 1 over V. That's just 1, right? I'm just multiplying by something over something. But if you distribute that in, then what you get is S over V in the numerator, and then you get C over V in the denominator plus V over V, but that's just 1. And if you look at this, then you see, oh, what's in the numerator is really just E, right? S over V is equal to E. And C over V, that's K. And so what we have is this equation. We have that pi is equal to the rate of exploitation divided by the composition of capital plus 1. Now this, in my opinion, this is probably top 5 most evil equations in existence. Just look at this. Seriously, just look at this. What is this saying? What is this saying? What it's saying is that if K is increasing, right, and K is down here in the denominator, if the composition of capital is increasing over time, then unless the rate of exploitation increases to compensate, then the rate of profit will drop. So even here, and a lot of critics of Marx, claim that he's predicting something. He's predicting that the profit rate was going to fall. No, he's saying there's a tendency for the profit rate to fall, and that tendency for the profit rate to fall is going to incentivize the capitalist to behave a certain way. And I think this is the most honest version of that, in a sense. This kind of says what the drive of the capitalist is. The drive of the capitalist is you've got to ramp up exploitation, because if you don't, the profit rate will fall. So what this says, let me just repeat that, is that this says that as K increases, which we've shown that it will, pi will fall, the profit rate will fall unless exploitation increases. Unless you exploit the population more, the profit rate falls. So you better exploit the population more. So that's why I think this is probably like the most incendiary, like kind of banger version. You can just kind of define these three rates, and then you can say, hey, look, you can express pi in terms of the other two, and then you get this equation that is just straight up evil. And it does obfuscate a few things. Like there's a few things to note about this, but Before we get into those, I mean, I don't want to like downplay it. This is a very useful equation, and the main reason that I decided to do a rate of profit video first and a rate of accumulation video second is because when we get into the dynamics of capitalism and start to like look through the boom bust cycle and look at what's going to happen as capital accumulates in the next video, I thought it would be very useful to specifically have this equation in the back of our minds. This is something that I want you to kind of remember and think about as we go on. This is, I think, just as useful of an expression of the rate of profit as S over C plus V. Now, what's being obfuscated here? I mentioned that there's kind of some misleading stuff going on here, kind of, and specifically, we note that it's not actually the case that as k increases, pi is going to fall, right? First, we know that there's actually a stronger condition that's necessary for that. This makes it look that like the profit rate will fall if the composition of capital goes up at all, and we know that that's not the case. In order for the rate of profit to fall as a result of the composition of capital increasing, it has to be increasing in such a way that C is increasing faster than V decreases. Otherwise, you're just moving around this needle here, and you're not actually shrinking the length of the surplus part of the day, which is what you have to be doing to actually drop the rate of profit. So that's one thing that's missing, and the reason that that's missing, the reason that you can't see it here, what's hidden here is that K and E both depend on V. They're not independent. You're not usually going to have it be the case that the composition of capital increases with E staying the same. Right? V is the denominator of both of these, right? V is the denominator of both. And since it's the denominator of both, what does that mean? That means that if one goes up as a result of V going down, the other one will have a tendency to go up as well. It doesn't have to, but it usually will. You're usually not going to get an increase in the composition of capital without getting a natural increase in the rate of exploitation. So don't get me wrong. What I'm saying here as being obfuscated by this version of the falling rate of profit is not necessarily undermining it. It's actually a little more sinister even, because I mean, and the reason for that is just kind of let's draw the bar again, right? So here's C and here's V and here's S. If I increase C over V, even if I don't increase C more than V increases, let's just move this line a little bit, right? Right now S over V is something like 1/2, right? Let's move this line over though. Now V is smaller by virtue of C kind of fronting on it, and now V is smaller. But since S remains the same, S over V is now a bigger fraction too, right? The size of C increased with respect, in comparison to V, but since S didn't change, the size of S also changes with respect to V. Now it's, the kind of part of the day that the working class and the capitalists are fighting over has shrunk, and one of them has not been, but one of them has not lost their time, and the other one has. And so it's actually generally the case that if V is really the driver of K increasing, which we said that it was, then it's the natural course of things is for E to go to infinity as K goes to infinity. They actually kind of rise direct with each other. So that's something that I think is important to note. Another thing that I think is important to note, though, is that the degree... this also makes it look like E can completely compensate for the rise in K. It looks like, okay, K goes up by 5, now we just bring E up by 5, and that'll compensate, right? But we see actually, it's very easy to see that that's actually not the case. Why is the rate of profit falling? The rate of profit is not falling because the composition of capital is rising. The rate of profit is falling because the necessary part of the working day is eating up all of the surplus time. And so it doesn't matter, right? And so you can compensate a little bit, right? If the necessary part of the day is like all the way over to here, and let's just say like V is, a little less dramatic. Let's say V is like right here, right? I can compensate for the lack of my surplus part of the day by raising exploitation. I can move this line over, and that gives me more surplus part of the day back. But that only goes so far. The more this process goes on, the less that is capable of actually helping me. And we can see that mathematically. There's a way to see this with another expression for pi that I want to show you. So so I'll call this like part 1 in terms of like what order things to note. One is that K and E tend to increase with each other, and that's kind of hidden in this equation. But another thing I want us to note is that the degree to which exploitation can compensate for this process for the falling rate of profit is very limited. And so to see that mathematically, I've already kind of explained that visually, right? This bar is going to move forwards, and you can smush this down this way as much as you want, but that's not going to like help you. That's not going to help. That's going to help you less and less the worse this gets. But let's kind of see that mathematically, and the way to do that is to kind of look at, first of all, let's. I did this already, but I want to do it again. So I know that E is equal to S over V, and so that means that S is equal to E times V. And now I want to kind of look at these two bars together as like L. I've done that before, obviously. So then L is equal to V plus S, and I can replace S with E times V. So this is V plus E times V, and if I factor out V, I get 1 plus E times V. I know I did that already, but I did that in the context of telling some of my viewers to just skip ahead, so now I'm doing it here. And so now I can solve for V. I just have that V is equal to L over 1 plus E. So I have this, and the reason I wanted that is now I can write pi. Pi is S over C plus V. What I can do here is I can multiply the numerator by V over V. Just 1, right? But if I put a V over V here, and then I pull out these two, right, this one and this one, then I can kind of factor out E. So this is equal to V times S over V over C plus V, and this is E. And so I have that pi is equal to V over C plus V times E. And now if I take this V here, and I replace it with this equation for V that I have here, that it's L over 1 plus E. And so if I do, then what I get is that pi is equal to L over 1 plus E over C plus V times E. Now I know that looks like a mess, but I can clean it up and you'll see why I'm doing this. All I have to do to clean it up is bring this denominator out. Really what I have here is like L over 1 plus E times C plus V times E. And I'm just going to bring this over here. And so what I get is that pi is equal to L over C plus V times E over 1 plus E. So I have kind of these two terms here. Now I'm not going to put a box around this one because I don't need you to remember it. I would like it if people remembered this. This evil equation here is a very important thing that I think people should have in their heads. This is just to see a point. This isn't super important that you remember it, but it is saying something that's worth noting, which is what we noted visually already, that E can't compensate very much. So basically what we have here is I've kind of pulled out all the E stuff. And so, you know, suppose that this process of C over V getting bigger has kind of gone on a while already. And we've seen how that process is going to kind of usually involve E increasing, which means that V is also going to kind of go to 0. And so basically as this gets going, you know, this is going to go to 0, or maybe I should rather say becomes negligible. And then at the same time that V becomes negligible, this L term here becomes basically just S. And so kind of what you can kind of think of this as is it's basically this term here is really just S over C, which I think maybe makes it a little simpler. It's not really the main point I'm trying to make. The main point I'm trying to make is like this guy right here. So E over 1 plus E is, let's think about what it is. When E is small, this is close to 0, right? When E is like 0, this is literally 0. And when E is like basically nothing, this is still basically nothing. And as I increase E from 0, this does get kind of going pretty fast. But the thing is, as E gets bigger and bigger, what's going to happen? Think about when E is 1,000. If E is 1,000, then this is 1,000 over 1,001. That's basically just 1. When E is 100,000, this is 100,000 over 100,001. That's closer to 1. This thing can't get above 1. So E over 1 plus E is increasing with E. So it does help pi. So it getting bigger does help prevent pi from shrinking. But it's going to help less the bigger this is. But it's very limited. It can't get bigger than 1. and it increases slower and slower. Right, the bigger the E is, the less it's going to move when you make it bigger again. And kind of to put all that together and make a graph of it, it basically looks like this. So I'll put like, this is the E axis down here, and then to graph it is basically you get something like this, where this is 1. That's what that looks like. It just kind of approaches 1, and at first it approaches it quite quickly, right? But it kind of veers, it gets slower very fast, and it never gets bigger than 1. So I think this is just a kind of a good mathematical kind of symbolic confirmation of what we already noted, which is that the real reason that the rate of profit is shrinking is that the necessary part of the working day is getting bigger, and that is squashing this S region, which is the profit region. This is what the capitalist makes their money. And so as that happens, S is obviously going to push back, and it will have some success in pushing back. It'll squash V, but its attempt to push back all the way is futile. It's not really going to. It can forestall the inevitable a little bit, and it will inflict significant pain on the working population as it does so. We've seen what shrinking V really means, and we'll talk more about it in the next video. And it will do so, but it will do so futilely. It will do so futilely. The rate of profit, by Marx's argument, which is what I'm trying to present here, will fall regardless of how hard the capitalist class tries to declare war on the working class to compensate. It won't really succeed. Unless the working day is made longer. There is a catch to the argument I just made. And so let's observe that catch next. And observing that catch requires us to stare at this other term on the left here, this S over C plus V. Because S is actually equal to T minus C plus V. And V we said was negligible. And so what this term actually is, you can rewrite it again as T minus C over C times E over 1 plus E. And this, I think, is the most honest way to write it, because this actually kind of makes clear what has to be fixed in order to kind of isolate E in this way. We can isolate E this way as long as we keep the working day fixed. And so to the extent that you can make the working day longer, you actually can have the rate of exploitation account in tandem to the increasing C region. However, there is a limit to that, right? You can increase T, which was what we said in the very beginning. We're really just kind of returning to that. But you can only increase T so much. At the very least, there is a biological limit to the extent to which you can make the working day longer. There's a point at which you've made the working day so long that the workers just cannot properly get enough rest to like come back in and work again. And at that point, you don't have a society that can reproduce itself. Now, this is actually what Marx thought was going on. When Marx was writing about factory conditions in his Victorian era, he actually did believe that T was extended to its maximum length, to the point where if it was made any longer, the workers would die. I've seen some textbooks refer to the maximum length of the working day as T bar. So that's important to note, although it doesn't really affect the argument that the extension of E is at some point futile. Once you reach this maximum length of the working day, the argument I just gave for why E is not going to help very much is going to kick in and apply. So even with this noted, we know that the capitalists can only futilely kind of forestall this process. So it might seem at this point like we've given a pretty comprehensive analysis of the law of the falling rate of profit, and we have. But there's a whole other side of the story that we haven't explored at all yet. And to understand where that side comes from, let me draw a little picture to kind of illustrate some things that we've said already. So basically, let's think about this from the perspective of a capitalist. In fact, let's draw our little capitalist. So here's a capitalist. It's just a random person, but let's give him like a top hat and a monocle. So here's our capitalist. And what the capitalist is seeing looks something like this. We've basically got this magic box, this machine called the labor machine. And it takes two kinds of fuel. The first kind of fuel that it takes is wages. And I'll draw those as little like dollar bills. That's the first kind of fuel that it takes. But it also takes a second kind of fuel, and that kind of fuel is raw materials. That's sort of what we've been talking about, right? In order to kind of keep a labor machine working for an hour, you have to feed it a certain amount of raw materials. It has to absorb raw materials. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there doing nothing. So raw materials are a fuel for the labor machine every bit as much as wages are. And the labor machine has an output, of course, like most machines. And so we can view that as like a faucet. And what's coming out of the faucet is, from the capitalist's perspective, what? The capitalist is staring at the faucet and they're seeing surplus value. They're seeing profit come out of the faucet. The labor machine is the only machine that produces it. It's a magic machine that you feed it stuff and it produces for you profit. It's the profit machine. So what we've been saying, basically, the law of the falling profit rate essentially says the labor machine is going to over time require more and more fuel in the form of raw materials. It's gonna seem like I'm having to shovel in way more fuel over time than before to get any output. And the other thing that it's basically saying is that this faucet is going to be sort of closing over time. That less and less water is going to be coming out of the faucet. And eventually it's just going to look like little drips are coming out. It's pouring out in the beginning of capitalism, but as capitalism develops, it's going to look like the capitalist is going to see their faucet closing over time. But that's only if you're focused completely on the value form of the output. If you think about the output in real terms, if you're a normal person looking at the faucet, if you're a normie and you're staring at the faucet, what are you seeing? You're seeing the complete opposite effect. Because think about it like this. What does an hour of output look like? That is to say, look at it like an individual droplet of water, right? That's kind of like what I'm talking about with an hour of output. If I'm focused entirely on the value form of the output, and in particular I'm focused entirely on the profit that is coming from that value form of the output, in other words, if I'm a capitalist, then I'm seeing a smaller and smaller drop of water because of that hour, less and less of it represents profit. And so if I'm a capitalist, that's why I see this faucet drying up. But in real terms, that hour of output looks like a bundle of goods. It looks like a bunch of stuff. And in the year 1900, maybe that hour of stuff looks like 2 shirts, right? Or a couple of items of fruit. But in the year 2020, that 1 hour of output might be like 100 shirts. It might be like a fifth of a jet, right? China can make an entire hospital in like 2 days. That hour of output is actually getting bigger from a real perspective. It represents more and more stuff over time. And so if you can look past the value form of the output, if you can see the output in real terms as a bunch of stuff coming out of the faucet, then this faucet is positively bursting. It's exploding. It is getting bigger and bigger. The flow is insane. I can barely keep track of it. And so that's really interesting because if it's crazy because the law of the falling profit rate, if you're looking at it in real terms, almost seems to say the opposite of what we just finished saying that it says. In real terms, the law of the falling profit rate says that this faucet's going to blow the hell up. But in value terms, it says that it's going to dry up. So that's kind of interesting in its own right. But it also begs the question, what is happening to this output? We've been very focused on the raw material side of this whole visual, right? We've been very focused on this part, but we haven't really thought so much about what the output is going to do. We really have 3 kinds of commodities that I think are worth talking about. So the first kind is the capital goods. The capital goods are the outputs that are being used as inputs as raw materials. Essentially, I need to make steel. I need to refine metal into steel, and that's one of the raw materials that needs to go in here as fuel. So a lot of the commodities are actually just being used in the production of other commodities. That's the capital goods. Now, insofar as the capital goods are being used for the creation of other capital goods, this increased output is kind of making up for this increased input and vice versa. They're kind of accounting for each other and creating sort of a self-compensating flow. So in that sense, strictly for that case of the capital goods that are being used as raw materials for other capital goods, the fact that this is getting bigger isn't really a problem because this is also getting bigger and this goes straight into this. So this is kind of the first circulation, and it doesn't really need to, it doesn't need to be really worried about so much. Now, that isn't all of the capital goods. There are some capital goods coming out of here, of course, that are going to be used to make some kind of use values. In fact, probably most of them. So at some point, you've got to use these capital goods to actually make something that people want, that society wants. Um, but there's a good amount of them that are just kind of making up for the raw materials increase in their own output. That this gets bigger, but this gets bigger too, and it just kind of accounts for itself. And so this is the flow of capital goods. Now, another thing that's very worth saying about this flow is that it is absolutely getting thicker over time. Like, this circulation involves more and more stuff over time. I've got this kind of consistent flow of capital goods, which isn't really producing like any kind of crises of overproduction, but it is a line that is continually getting thicker over time. And so the line getting thicker over time, what we're seeing here is what we're going to talk about more in the next video, which is accumulation. This thickening line represents the accumulation of capital. And there's one other kind of line that is also going to thicken over time. It's kind of coming off like right here, and this is the second type of good, which is the wage goods, the consumer goods. The wage and the consumer goods are the goods that are being, that, you know, I'm giving these, you know, one of the types of fuel is money handed to the workers in the form of wages. They're going to go and they're going to buy this stuff. So that's another thickening flow. So this is also thickening. And this thickening flow is a problem, because I am not necessarily giving the workers more wages. I am giving them more raw materials, and so there is a use for this this continually enlarging output. But this is also a line that is getting thicker over time, and that is going to be a problem, because if I want somebody to, if I want it to be used, which I do, because I need to get that profit back, I need to turn these commodities into actual profit, and that requires trading it. Then there's a clear contradiction there, because on the one hand, I don't want to pay the workers more, but on the other hand, I need the workers to buy more stuff. And that is going to create crises of overproduction, which is going to be one of the major subjects of the next video. The reason I'm really bringing this up now is that we have kind of these two kinds of accumulation. We've got this accumulation over here and accumulation over here, and they in a sense have to mirror each other. And what I mean by them having to mirror each other is, like, you know, I used a steel example before. We're continually refining more and more metal into steel. That's going to happen. But if I'm not using that steel to make any goods for, like, consumers, if I'm not using it to make anything in this region, then I've got to be constantly coming up with new reasons that we need that steel. You know, that steel can't just sit there. There has to be like a societal justification for its existence. So basically there arises the need for a third flow. And obviously that flow has something to do with the luxury goods flow, but I think it's misleading to just call this the luxury goods flow. This flow this flow is a little different in my opinion. It's basically like a chimney. It's like a heat sink for the economy. It's like an escape valve. It's the set of excuses that are made to continually let this thing get bigger. You've got to process more and more raw materials, but the purpose of processing those raw materials is just to keep this machine on. It takes more and more raw materials to keep this machine on, but you're also spitting out more and more capital goods, and you've got to do something with that. You know, you've got to direct the productive forces elsewhere if you're not directing them in this direction. And so you could call this, you know, the luxury goods sector. But it's really a lot more than that. I'm just going to call it other. It's basically just other stuff that society has deemed necessary to create that has nothing to do with a direct increase in the scale of the economy. It's an escape valve in the sense that it's kind of like a chimney that ejects things out of the economy. You get this kind of accumulation of luxuries outside of the economy that's almost a separate kind of accumulation. One of the best examples of this is military spending. We come up with kind of threats that exist outside of ourselves, and then we make a bunch of bombs. We decide that it's socially necessary to make bombs all day so that we can blow them up. You know, that obviously doesn't have anything to do with accumulation in either of these senses. It's kind of an accumulation of commodities that are exiting the economy. And the reason that we're doing that, regardless of what the capitalists say or think, the real reason why that's happening, the real reason why over time it becomes more and more necessary to make stuff like that, is that this machine must keep going. The goal is not to actually, like, make something specific. The goal is to keep this machine on and operating at the same scale, despite the raw materials need and the output getting bigger and bigger over time. The necessity of some kind of escape valve grows. And the reason I'm saying this is because I wanted to talk about the growth of this C region here. Now, I've been calling this necessary labor. I've been calling the C plus V region the necessary part of the working day, but we always need to remember that what that means, what socially necessary means in the context of capitalism, is what is necessary for profit. Why is that? It's because what I defined as necessary raw materials are the necessary raw materials to repeat the thing that we're doing the next day. So that's the idea, is to roll over to the next day, but we're specifically talking about rolling over to the next day of capitalism. And we've said that in a normal day of capitalism, the capitalists get a certain amount of surplus labor. And so if we're to repeat the same thing tomorrow, then the capitalists need to again get the same amount of surplus value tomorrow. And so this is necessary labor, but it is specifically necessary for profit. Profit and social necessity are one and the same in a capitalist society. That's what we're talking about. And so when we talk about what's necessary for profit, the necessary part of the working day in terms of raw materials and fuel grows, but only one kind of fuel. And that fuel only serves the purposes of a profiting system. What of this region actually is necessary to just maintain the machines as they exist and to produce this V region? Probably a tiny sliver. Probably a sliver that's getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. And so that's important to keep in mind, because what that means is that the C region is becoming increasingly political as capitalism develops. It's going to become a more and more important question: what do we do with this region, and is this region really necessary? What is socially necessary? We're going to have to rethink that in a post-capitalist society. What is socially necessary is going to change, because necessity is going to be no longer defined as profiting. What's necessary for profit is some kind of output for this system. And in that sense, what is necessary is making a bunch of bombs. But if I take one of those gigantic bombs and I look at its composition, and I think about essentially like where did the labor to go make those bombs fall in this timeline of the working day? Well, I'll promise you, it sure didn't fall in here. It sure didn't fall in this V region. It fell in the C region and this S region. It has nothing to do with V. Of course, like an abstract unit of output does have a V component, but that's only kind of that is an abstraction, right? The yacht itself, the mansion made for the capitalist, has nothing to do with this V region, but it also is at the same time most of where this C region is increasing for. The C region is increasing in the service of a machine that must keep going in the name of profit, not in the name of people. And so when you look at the working day, what you absolutely should not do is you should see that, okay, this necessary part of the working day is getting longer, and so after a revolution or something, we just cut this S region out, but we still have to work 7 hours a day or something like that. That's not true at all. We can cut that way, 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 way down. We've made enough. There's been enough production for production's sake. We can see that clearly around us. So at this point, we're very aware that the law of the falling rate of profit is much more than just a prediction that the rate of profit will fall. It is that, and I do believe that there is such a thing, but it's you shouldn't treat it as just a prediction that the profit rate will fall. You should treat it as essentially the same way that you treat like Newton's second law. It's a relationship between variables that will remain in place as long as the system develops. Now, it is a fuzzy law. There are assumptions that we made to get here that are simplifications and not really true of our own actual physical reality. But it is my opinion that those assumptions, even when you pull on those threads, while they might create problems in the theory, they don't completely undermine like the kind of very real observations that are being made about our system that we've made. And even if there's something so unbelievably wrong with this argument that this doesn't actually translate to a falling rate of profit from the perspective of the capitalist class, and I don't think that's the case, by the way, but even if that is the case, I still think that what we've observed here is extremely important and valuable, because what we've observed in real terms is that we have a system that produces more and more and more, faster and faster and faster, and that the point isn't necessarily to make cool stuff that people want. It's just to keep this labor machine going all day, every day, for as long as possible. And that it's actually disincentivized to take that increasing output and that accelerating output and put it all towards wage and consumer goods. In other words, in real terms, what we've observed with the falling rate of profit is that we have a tendency within capitalism to just come up with reasons to make garbage that doesn't actually matter. That we've rationalized reasons to just make stuff that we don't actually need to make. That this has infected our thought process in terms of what we actually want to be doing all day. We're spending more and more of the day making things that probably don't actually matter. And that in a post-capitalist society, we're really going to probably have to take a hard look at what it is that we are spending our day producing and ask ourselves, do we really want to keep making this? And just to really hammer in that this necessary labor is extremely wasteful, I thought of another example that I'm amazed I didn't think of earlier, which is anything that we discard. All the trash we make, all the things that we make and just throw away, all the unused things. And yes, I know that includes wage and consumer goods, but if a lot of wage and consumer goods don't actually get made for the consumers because they don't get bought by any of the consumers. All that stuff, how do you really call that V? That is not really labor for the workers. It's making worker goods, but it's not really labor for the workers. But it is necessary labor. It was labor done to keep the working day going. Now, you're probably wondering about how the capitalist could possibly profit off of goods that don't sell to actual consumers in the market. But hold that thought for a second and just focus on what we're talking about here. We're not talking about money. We're talking about value. We're talking about value production. The capitalists decided to make something. They hired somebody to do it, and they got some free labor. Surplus value was given to them. Right? That's the accounting we're doing. We're not talking about money. We're talking about free labor given over to the capitalist. Now, I claim that in almost all circumstances, that surplus value created will translate to money profit for the capitalist. But that money that falls into the capitalist's hands is just the paper receipt for the social agreement that value was produced. Whether the state prints dollar bills and gives them to banks, which gives them to companies, which gives them to workers and wages that take those wages to the market and trade them for commodities, so those wages end up in the hands of other companies in the form of profit, or whether the state just short circuits that process and just gives it directly to the companies in the form of bailouts, it doesn't really matter. The handshake is completed, and the handshake is just a social agreement that confirms the observation that value was produced. But that's all besides the point. My point is that this stuff was all produced as necessary labor. Society decided it was necessary to produce it, otherwise they wouldn't have produced it. It doesn't matter that tomorrow it turned out that it had no use value and had no point to be made. It was made, and since it was made, it was necessary. We considered it necessary, and so we made it. And we do believe in our heads that it's necessary. If you don't believe me, go up to an apologist for capitalism and ask them about this trash. Ask them about all the waste. See what they have to say. They will probably solemnly shake their heads with their eyes closed, and then they'll talk about how it's a shame and it's a tragedy, but it's also necessary. They'll probably say something along those lines. So this is a very real thing. This is more than just a technicality. And it's proof that the C region is becoming very political and something we need to think about. So we're going to spend the rest of this video kind of using the rate of profit to understand and analyze both history and think about the future. Which means that we're going to use it in two different ways. We're going to use it both as a prediction that the rate of profit will fall, and we're going to think about what society is going to do as that happens. And we're also going to look at history and basically, as we do that, get a sense of what counteracting forces there are. In other words, how the capitalists can act as a class to stop this thing from falling. And that leads us to one last kind of theoretical observation that is worth making before we get into that, which is that we have to remember that the rate of profit, as a prediction that it's going to fall, is going to fall because of the individual actions of capitalists acting in competition to one another. However, in capitalist society, the capitalists also end up being the ones basically in charge of the government. They end up being the ones with control of the state. And so the capitalists, in their individual competition with one another, are going to be causing the things that we've described. But then also, the capitalists acting as a unified class at the head of the state are going to take collective action to prevent this thing from falling. It's almost like the capitalists have split personality disorder. It's almost like the rate of profit ends up being like a death drive that the capitalists are both propelled by and working against. It's very interesting in that sense. And so to kind of illustrate this dual motivation, as well as pretty much everything we've said so far, I thought of this picture to draw, just kind of inside of the picture that we've already been drawing. So we've got the dual motivation of the capitalists in the sense that you've got capitalists over here on the right, and you've also got capitalists over here on the left doing completely different things. And then you've got workers in the middle. And so the capitalists on the left are acting individually, and they're pushing this C region forwards. But then capitalists on the right, in the form of the state, are trying to push back to try to account for that, and they're doing so futilely. That's why I drew more of them on the left than on the right. But either way, the worker in the middle, they're getting squashed. So they're unhappy. They are getting going to be smushed. So I think that's kind of cute. But with that said, let's go ahead and move on to seeing what we can see about what's actually going to happen in society as a result of a falling rate of profit. So let's say that the profit rate is falling. What does that actually mean for society? What's going to happen? Well, I mean, the lower the profit rate is, the less incentivized capitalists are going to be to reinvest their surplus to scale up or innovate, right? And so what it most directly translates to is just a slowdown of the dynamism of capitalism, right? I mean, we're going to see development slow down. We're going to see the scaling up of the economy, the thickening of those lines. It's all just going to slow down to a crawl or even seem to stop. The big inventions are going to become smaller, and the smaller inventions might just stop happening. In other words, society, what a falling profit rate looks like is it looks like a society that's gradually running out of its own social fuel. So that's kind of the most direct thing to look at. But we can also think about how people are going to act in this situation. For example, the capitalist class, as they see their profit rate falling, as they become less incentivized to invest, they're going to become kind of frustrated. And they're going to look for things to do about it. Meanwhile, the working class is going to notice the slowdown, and they're going to wonder why they're still doing this system, why they're still working within this system. Nothing is happening. And so, what happens next really depends on the composition of political power. But focusing on the capitalists might, in their frustration about the current state of things, they might decide to go on strike, in the sense of they might decide to collectively stop reinvesting altogether, right? They might force a crisis in that way. So Marxists like to kind of theorize about the various possible types of crises that you can get within capitalism, and the one that we're starting to kind of veer into talking about is known as a profit squeeze crisis. So let's start to talk about how the different classes are likely to relate to something like a profit squeeze crisis. We were starting with the capitalists, and we already mentioned that they were likely to, that one thing that they might do is kind of go on strike with their reinvestment to some extent. But going on strike isn't really something that you need to do if you have political power. If you have political power, then you're probably going to do something with it, right? So if the capitalist class has a lot of political power, then they're likely to use it, and we already know how they're likely to use it. They're going to try to ramp up exploitation if they have political power. Or if they don't have political power, and this is kind of related to that kind of strike idea, but it doesn't have to be limited to that, they'll probably try to seize power. They'll probably try to, use their money to influence public policy and stuff. They'll probably just wage a general assault, on the political system in an attempt to take control of it. Meanwhile, if for some reason you have workers in power at that point, the workers might look around and say, well, I mean, maybe it would be better for us to nationalize key industries and start to produce according to a plan, because if nothing is changing, we might as well make sure that this thing is stable, right? And so a lot of Marxists tend to view profit squeeze crises, I think, as like the big crises that could actually lead to a socialist transition. That might sound ridiculous in our current reality, but after World War II in Western Europe, and to some extent the United States, workers did have a lot of power. Unions did have a lot of power. They weren't revolutionary. They weren't trying to destroy capitalism, but they had a lot of say in the government. They had a lot of power. And I haven't looked into this closely, but I've heard that they actually were having discussions in Parliament prior to Thatcher about nationalizing key industries and producing according to a state plan. That was an actual thing that was being discussed. But this all depends on whether or not the workers, keep the decision-making power and the capitalists don't get it, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what we got when we had a profit squeeze crisis in the prelude to neoliberalism. I think that neoliberalism can and should be seen as a profit squeeze crisis in which the capitalist class of the world seized power and took desperate hysterical action to crank that thing back up. And we know now what cranking that thing back up means. To offset the falling rate of profit, what do? You ramp up exploitation. What did you see in neoliberalism? What does neoliberalism consist of? Well, it consists of massive cutting of social programs, massive cutting of state spending in the interests of people. It consists of breaking up of unions. It consists of breaking up of the ability for unions to have a say in the government. All of these things are assaults on the working class in order to bring up the rate of exploitation and weaken their power overall. So in order to think about what else the falling rate of profit kind of means and how we can use it to kind of interpret history up until now, let's think about a few of the ways that you can increase the rate of profit without besides simply ramping up exploitation. Of course, that's the one we talked about, but there are others that aren't as apparent but are very clear. One of them is to increase the size of the workforce. One of the assumptions that we've been making is that the population is constant. But of course, more workers does mean more surplus value. And so the rate of profit is proportional to the rate of population growth. And so if your population is growing, then you are getting, in some sense, some boost in the rate of profit. However, now obviously, in our first world kind of countries that we have, it seems like population growth is going to zero. It seems, or negative, right? I mean, I think, Japan is losing like hundreds of thousands of people every year in terms of their workforce. Their workforce is shrinking, and that's kind of a common thing throughout these developed capitalist societies. But there's other ways to increase the size of your population besides just having your own workers reproduce more. The big example of this is to just integrate into your system a whole other society, right? To bring, to colonize India. And that's actually an even better way to do it, because if you're bringing in workers from India, if you're proletarianizing large chunks of the population, or just bringing in part-time workers, either way that you do that, you're probably bringing in people at a lower wage, right? If you've dispossessed a whole bunch of Mexican peasants, then they're probably desperate, so they're willing to work for low wages, and so there you go. That's a higher rate of exploitation at the same time that you're getting a new population. But in the case of India, or like post kind of communist China, or like post, what I mean, post like Mao China, or whatever you want to call it, those township and village enterprises, they had, the peasants working in those enterprises got a lot of social assistance. They didn't need as much in wages because they had a lot of coverage already, just kind of socially. It's wild that those socialist programs in China served to actually attract capital way more, because it means that the people that are working for wages don't need as much stuff in wages. And so that's another way to, from the standpoint of the system that's integrating it, bring up the rate of exploitation. So you're bringing in a higher population, you're bringing up the rate of exploitation, and then on top of all of that, this is a great opportunity to basically bring in new industries that are much more labor intensive than before. So for example, British India had a huge cotton industry, and cotton farming hadn't been modernized yet. So at that point, it was extremely, I think is still extremely labor intensive. And so you're bringing in a more labor intensive industry. And so what is that doing to the overall composition of capital in your society? It's lowering it. You've lowered your average composition of capital by integrating in this more labor intensive industry. And because of that, what's happened to your rate of profit? It's risen again. So that's a triple whammy. That's three different ways to offset the falling rate of profit all at the same time. Imperialism is a pretty profitable thing. And believe it or not, that's not even the best reason to do imperialism. I've saved the best for last. The biggest and most important offsetting factor to the rate of profit, to the falling rate of profit, and something that some people use to claim that there is no falling rate of profit, it even goes that far, is to lower the cost of raw materials. So let's think about that. The reason that the rate of profit is falling, the technological argument, is that as labor productivity increases, the worker needs to absorb more raw materials. And so those raw materials cost me more money, and so the cost of operation increases. Unless the cost of the raw materials also falls at the same or faster rate. If I have to absorb more and more steel as innovation increases, but the steel itself drops in price faster than the productivity increases, then I could have an increasing rate of profit. And this is why I actually made a huge fuss out of the labor-saving bias. I made a huge fuss to say that the capitalists are going to be incentivized to target specifically labor reduction, because if they target raw materials, then there is a high chance that the raw materials fall in price faster than the rate of productivity increases, and you don't actually get a falling rate of profit. But in terms of offsetting the falling rate of profit, assuming that there is that bias, This is another argument for imperialism, because how do you get cheap resources? Well, there's resources are not evenly distributed throughout the earth. There are certain locations where resources are just much easier to obtain, right? There are certain places on earth where just oil is concentrated, and it's much easier to obtain oil from like a really big reserve in, say, Iran than to like do an extensive fracking operation. And so what do? Well, I mean, you set up a puppet government in Iran, and you have them sell you cheap oil, right? You do geopolitics, you do geo-imperialism, you take control of resource reserves. And this is itself a double whammy, because on the one hand, you have access to like cheaper resources that you can use in your country, but then if another country wants them, you can charge super profits for them. You can charge monopoly like prices. And I'm not going to get into it, but Marx has a whole theory in volume 3 called his theory of ground rent for why you'd get super profits here, and it's actually pretty simple why. If I get control of like a reserve in which I can like drill for lots of oil in a very short amount of time, a shorter amount of time than the average, the socially necessary amount of time, then it's basically as if I had come up with a labor-saving invention and I get super profits for that, but I just never don't get super profits for that. It's just a constant thing. It's super profits, but it's the best possible kind, in which the rest of the world, the rest of the capitalists simply cannot compete. They can't do the same thing I did because I control this big resource reserve. So one thing you might be thinking right now is that you might be feeling unimpressed. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, so what you're telling me is the capitalists are doing imperialism because it's profitable. Well, I could have guessed that already. I already could have understood why these things you're describing are profitable. So what the hell is there to gain from this? And you're right, but the thing is, what this is giving us is something stronger than that. With the context of a falling rate of profit, we can now understand that the capitalist class feels a constant subconscious pressure of existential death if they don't do this. That is subtly motivating all of the decisions that they make as those decisions present themselves. They are driven to do this. That's new. That's something that you didn't have before. Obviously, everybody knew that doing this kind of stuff was very profitable. But you can now understand that it's not that they're doing it because they're bad people, although they are. They're doing it because there is a pressure on them to do it. There is an existential threat to capitalism if they don't do it. And I think that systemic push to doing imperialism is important for two reasons. The first reason is that it completely refutes any kind of idea and any kind of potential people saying, oh, if this is just human nature, is to be greedy like this. No, there is a systemic force pushing them to make certain decisions the way that they make them. That's number one. Number two is that it highlights that the culprit of this, what's driving imperialism, is capitalism. In other words, the only way you're going to get rid of imperialism, the only way you're going to stop this is to stop capitalism. That's a conclusion that you can draw. Or at the very least, you can say to yourself, I'm never going to get rid of imperialism without getting rid of capitalism. Maybe if I get rid of capitalism, I still have imperialism, but I know for sure at this point that there's no getting rid of imperialism without getting rid of capitalism. Those are two important things to take away from this, I think. And those are conclusions that you couldn't draw without a falling rate of profit. So, if somebody says that it's human nature to do this kind of stuff to people, and it turns out that they're right, then there's just no hope. Then there's just nothing we can do to make a better world. But the falling rate of profit can give us a way out. It can tell us that, look, no, it's systemic forces that are driving people to make these decisions, and if we change the systemic forces, then we can change how people behave, and we can make it so that people treat each other better. If you don't have something like that, then you can't say that. And so I think that things like this make Marxism and stuff like this idea of a falling rate of profit very important. So that's just a bit of fuel for your imagination in terms of using the rate of profit and these equations that we've kind of come up with to kind of make sense of what's happened in the world during capitalism's history. And I think I wanted to kind of conclude the video by giving my own opinion about our current situation and using the rate of profit to kind of, or at least give my opinion about where we're at and what the rate of profit says about it. I think that the prediction of a falling rate of profit spelling out like kind of the doom of capitalism has never really applied until neoliberalism. I think that we are, and I think that the capitalist class seizing power and implementing neoliberalism has done a bit to offset the falling rate of profit. I think China has done quite a bit as well. But with both of those kinds of booms subsiding, I think we are really at a terminal point where the system is going to slow down, and it's going to continue slowing down. And I think that we're going to see, as per the equation, I think we're going to see the capitalist class go to greater and greater lengths to try to ramp up exploitation worldwide, and in a desperate play to raise it, and they are going to fail to raise it. I think that we are at this point where the rate of profit just simply cannot be affected very much by ramping up exploitation, and I don't think that that's going to stop the capitalist class from doing it. In fact, I think that's going to make them do it more. They're just going to keep trying to do it more. And so my interpretation of the rate of profit for the current moment is that I think that it is giving us a very dire warning about the future. I think that what it tells us is that we are in for some very, very bad times if we leave the decision-making of the events to come up to the current people in charge, up to the capitalist class, and hoping that they make, I think that hoping that they make the right decisions is going to just produce the worst possible outcomes. And that things will not get better until the working class decides that they should have the power and the capitalists should not. And I just hope that they come to that conclusion sooner rather than later, and I will do what I can to convince them of that. I also hope that when that time comes, that people will be willing to exercise some imagination about what a better future, a better world could be than this one. So to end the video, I did want to mention the loose threads and things that still need to be pursued within this theory. I apologize for how absurdly lazy this final slide is. I'm getting kind of tired. There are a couple problems with this argument. What I've done here is I've presented the argument the way that I've just presented uncritically Marx's argument. I haven't presented any modern criticism of it. And as far as I can tell, there are two big modern criticisms of it. And these are problems and they need to be addressed. The first of these problems is the equilibrium problem. So basically, what we've been assuming is that we are working with a naive labor theory of value. That is to say, we are in a society where supply and demand are in perpetual equilibrium, and also that prices are proportional to their values. Now, these two assumptions are actually incompatible. You can't have an equilibrium economy where the naive theory of the naive labor theory of value applies, because if the naive labor theory of value applies, then industries have differing rates of profit. More labor-intensive industries have higher rates of profit than lower labor-intensive industries, and so you won't have a supply-demand equilibrium because capitalists will immediately move their capital over to the more labor-intensive industries. And so to really discuss the actual situation, we'll have to get into the transformation problem, which will be a couple videos from now. And I've heard that once you kind of try to bring this technological argument into a true equilibrium model that is kind of sophisticated, that you do experience some problems. And by I've heard, I mean that I've kind of seen conflicting things on it. Like, I've gone through a pretty sophisticated model myself in a book, and I didn't notice anything. But I've heard that there are some problems, and I haven't identified them myself, and I didn't notice them either. But you know, that does remain to be done nonetheless, right? We do need to take this argument and put it into this context of an actual functional equilibrium economy in order to kind of derive results about our economy. That does need to be done. And number two is that the composition of capital, the conditions for this thing to actually increase, are more complicated than I said they were. I said that a labor-saving bias was sufficient for the composition of capital to grow. Now, that is an important condition to have, but it is not the only condition, because if you're reducing the labor times required to do everything, then that includes the labor times required to make the raw materials, and so the labor times for raw materials are dropping, and so the value of the raw materials are dropping, and so the C number actually is going to drop as a result of that labor-saving bias, because the productivity is going to apply to the capital goods industry as much as it applies to the wage goods industry. And so the technological conditions for the composition of capital to increase require a specification of some kind of relationship between technological change in the capital goods industry and technological change in the wage goods industry. I am not 100% clear on what those need to be, but from what I can tell from looking at the math myself, it doesn't really seem that hard to have a situation where the composition of capital increases. Now, there is a tendency among certain kinds of people to look at these problems with the falling rate of profit argument and either abandon it, even if they're Marxists, or just basically admit it that it's wrong. And I think that that's very wrong to do, because, like I said in a couple of videos ago, I think that there is a tendency for the lower class economic theory to go underdeveloped. And I think what we're really seeing with these two kinds of problems with the argument that Marx has presented is more so that than anything else. We're seeing evidence that we have a lower class economic theory, and that economic theory, as we can kind of predict, is going underdeveloped and requires further development. So these are threads that deserve to be pulled on, that deserve to be addressed, but I don't think that they are evidence for abandoning anything. They are simply things that need to be done. So that's my rate of profit video. It went very long, but I hope people found it useful. However, this was actually only in volume 3 of Capital. The real argument against capitalism is actually not the falling rate of profit argument. You can almost think of the law of the falling rate of profit as sort of an abstraction of the actual concrete argument, which he gives in volume 1, which is the general law of capital accumulation. So join me in the next video, in which we show why accumulation of wealth at one pole is accumulation of misery at another.